Hey everyone, welcome to Broadband Deployment News. A little bit of breaking news today. The FCC has released their production version of the Broadband Location Fabric. I'll be right back. Oops, couldn't see there mate, for a minute. But anyway, so again, breaking news. I'm Rick Uzzi here with Zcorum. And this is related to the FCC's mapping that they're trying to get together. They are working on collecting, or they're going to be working on collecting all of the information as to where broadband is available in this country. And that what they're really trying to determine is who is unserved and underserved as far as the definitions that are in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, specifically the BEAD portion of that. Broadband Equity and Access Deployment. There's $42.5 or so billion in that plan. And before they allocate most of those funds, they want to make sure, based on the legislation, that they are applying those funds to locations that are unserved and underserved. So what are those? So unserved locations are those that do not have access to 25 by 3, at least 25 by 3 service, so anything below that. Underserved would be anything that's below 100 by 20, obviously excluding the unserved, so it's anything, let's say, between 120 versus the 25 and 3. So it's those that are a little bit faster than 25 by 3 but do not get over the 100 by 20 mark. So that would be underserved. So we need to know where those locations are before we start giving states money so that they can then start giving it to the service providers to then build out in those areas. So we got to know who's served and who's underserved and unserved. So that's the whole reason that they're doing this, and that's been an issue because the way the mapping has worked in the past is that the FCC had a form called 477, and internet service providers needed to upload the locations where they served based on a census block group, on a census block, and not, let's say, individual locations. So if you had a census block that served 20, 50, 100 homes or some whatever is in that census block, and you only served a couple of the homes there, maybe it's on a fringe of your service area, you could say you served those couple of homes, and then that whole census block was then considered served. And that's not true, because you maybe had a good portion of the homes in that area that were not served. So that FCC data that was being collected was not accurate, and it was leaving these holes where people did not have access. So what they're trying to do now is get down to every single location, and that's what this broadband fabric is supposed to be for. So let me go through this. So this is the public notice for this. So it just came out, and this was actually expected. We knew this was going to be out by June 30th, so they've gotten it out a few days before. So what this is going to give you is a few extra days to take a look at it. If you're already in the preliminary fabric, you should be able to log in. If not, you can go ahead and request access to this, but this will give you a few extra days to look at the broadband fabric. You still cannot upload your data until June 30th, but you have access to it early. So they were able to get that ready. So let's just read through this real quick and I'll explain as I go here. So Broadband Data Task Force announces the availability of the production version of the Broadband Serviceable Location Fabric. By this public notice, the Broadband Data Task Force, Wireline Competition Bureau, blah, 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 and Office of Economics announced that the Broadband Serviceable Location Fabric that will be used for the inaugural broadband data collection is now available for broadband service providers and government entities to access, subject to procedures set forth in this public notice. So it says here inaugural. So this is the first time that service providers are going to be doing this here in June. And then this is going to be a biannual kind of thing. So June, probably have to do the beginning next year, and then June again, that kind of thing. So they're going to have to keep this updated. So as they expand their territory, as they add more locations or they increase speeds in the territory, for example, where they're covering, they can go ahead and update that. Broadband availability data as of June 30th can be submitted in the BDC beginning on June 30th. And initial filings are due no later than September 1st, 2022. So basically the window is June 30th through September 1st, 2022. Midnight or 11:59 Eastern Daylight Time is basically what that's going to come down to. This public notice is a continuation of the efforts by Congress and the Commission to establish a common data set of all locations in the United States where fixed broadband internet access service can be installed. So I guess I'll call it the bare fabric. The fabric that has been put together by CostQuest, who the FCC contracted with, is basically What it is just a data set of what is supposed to be all broadband serviceable locations in the United States. So they are looking at data from several different sources. And from there, they're looking at wherever there happens to be a structure. And then they spend a lot of time trying to figure out, does that structure actually, is it a place that should have broadband? For example, you might have a farm and there's 3 structures on it, including a barn and a stable or something else there. So maybe only the house is where the broadband should be. So they went through all of this data trying to figure out, okay, where are the serviceable locations in the United States? And that's really the kind of the fabric that all of this service provider broadband data is going to be laid on top of. It says the resulting fabric is a key component of the BDC because it will serve as the foundation on which fixed broadband providers' availability data will be overlaid. The first fabric public notice announced that a preliminary version of the fabric was available for fixed broadband service providers to assist them in preparing their broadband availability data for BDC. So they did come out, I think it was in April, and they said, hey, here's a preliminary fabric for you to play with. So they made that available to everyone. They announced it. I did a broadcast about that, trying to let people know. And they did that because they realized that this is the first time that service providers are going to be doing this, and it's going to be a little bit of a challenge for them to take their information and sync it up with the FCC's fabric data for a couple of reasons. One is the service providers are just used to, again, reporting one location in each census block. I think it was the census block that was not a census block group, I believe. So in each census block, they had to report, did they have service in that one area? They didn't have to specify addresses. It's like, yeah, we got this census block covered, even if they only covered like a small portion of it. Yeah, we are serving one customer here. Here's what their speed is, the latency, that kind of thing. So that's what they were used to doing. Now they're going to have to go through and say, they're going to have to look at their entire service area. Really, it's the homes passed. So every home that they pass where they can provide broadband service, they're either already providing that or they can provide it with a standard installation. So in other words, they've already got the fiber running down the street or the cable, coax cable running down the street, at different places at the curb, and they can install a customer within, let's say, 10 days. So it's like somebody calls for service. Yeah, we can hook you up. We do provide service to that area. It doesn't mean that they would have to extend their plant significantly in order to do that. It's those that would be a standard installation. So these are their homes passed. So they have to sync up their homes passed with the data that's in the broadband fabric. So first of all, the first challenge for them is they need to know every home that they pass. So they've got to know, hopefully they know this because hopefully they send out marketing material, mailings, those kinds of things, but who knows? I mean, some of the smaller service providers may not have that exactly down, but they got to start with a list of all of the addresses that they serve. Then they look at the FCC data, and the FCC data has addresses as well, so they've got to sync up those two things. And then the hard part, I think, is the FCC is not going to allow these service providers to upload the physical address of each location. The FCC has something called the location ID. It's like a 9 or 10-digit number, and that's, even though they have the address on the fabric, they also have the location ID, so the service provider has to match their address with the address in the FCC data and then use only the location ID when they upload their file. So that's a challenge. So I did a broadcast about that where the FCC has some help on how to do that. It's questionable how helpful that is. I found out because we were trying to duplicate what they did as they're doing all their Excel spreadsheet matching, and we're having a hard time with that. So I'm assuming other people are. We're trying to figure it out. If we ever figure it out, we'll try to help folks out with how to do that. But they did go through it in a fairly detailed manner. But when you're looking at a video and somebody clicking around on Excel, that can be a little bit difficult. So in any event, that's what has to happen. Either matching these Excel files that way, or larger service providers are used to working with GIS systems, and they may be able to do polygon shape files, kind of draw around their service area and then load the data in that way. So there's a couple of different ways they can do that. But they made this preliminary fabric available so that service providers could practice all of that and get all of that worked out, because now you've only got about 2 months to do your filing if you're an ISP. And because of that, because of all the help that the FCC is trying to provide, answering questions, they've got a help site that I'll link to, and then having this preliminary fabric available several months before, they're not going to be forgiving as far as the filing window here. You're really going to have to get your data in before September 1st, so you need to be thinking about that. If you've been working with the preliminary fabric, that's a good thing. If you haven't, get started as soon as you can, because you don't want to be late on that. The first public notice announced that a preliminary version of fabric was available, as I say here. to assist them in preparing the broadband availability data for BDC. The first Fabric public notice announced that data in the preliminary Fabric would be different in some respects from the data in the production Fabric that filers would use in the initial BDC filing window. So there's a couple of differences. One is that number I was talking about, that 9 to 10 digit location ID is different. So if you've gone through the process of the preliminary Fabric, you cannot just upload all of that data again. You're going to have to kind of redo everything that you did. The data in the preliminary Fabric started with a 9, I believe, and it starts with a 1, I think, in the production Fabric. So it's totally different. Then there's some, there's going to be changes there. I'm sure they've tweaked some things as far as which locations are serviceable and which are not. I think in the preliminary Fabric, it said all locations were serviceable. In the production Fabric, that's not going to be the case. In the preliminary Fabric, it didn't have unit numbers. If you were passing by a MDU or MTU, like a multi-dwelling unit, multi-tenant unit kind of place, it didn't have the number of units in that at that location, like 74 apartments, that kind of thing. So the production Fabric will have that. So there are some changes. You're going to have to redo this if you did practice, but if you did practice, you should be in a much better position to recreate all of that and put it in the production Fabric. The first Fabric public notice noted, however, that release of the preliminary version would enable fixed service providers to develop and test their methods to align their broadband availability data with the Fabric data format. And again, because they're doing that, they're saying it's a very high bar for somebody to get some kind of waiver on this date, and they're not likely. A lot of times the FCC would say, okay, you're not ready, we'll extend it another 4 months, whatever. They're not going to do that because everybody is waiting on these broadband maps so that we know where broadband is and where it's not, according to the definition of broadband, and then really according to the unserved and the underserved definitions that we have in the Act. So they are not going to extend that. I can almost guarantee it. We are now making the production version of the Fabric available to filers in advance of the June 30th, 2022 opening of the initial filing window. So you can go in there and look at it and look around and see what you got there. Access to the production version of the Fabric as the definitive set of locations for which broadband availability is reported. The Fabric plays a crucial role in the BDC in terms of reporting by fixed broadband service providers and other entities, displaying and assessing fixed broadband availability data on the Commission's maps, and for challenges to such data. So that's important too. So in addition to letting us know where we think broadband service is, so in other words, after all of the internet service providers put in their data and say, okay, we are providing service at this location, at this particular address or location ID, and they're going to have to provide certain information. That information, it's not that much information that they have to provide. Obviously, they say it's at this location ID, and they have to provide their maximum upload speed and download speed advertised, just whatever plan they're advertising, maximum advertised upload speed, download speed. They have to provide what type of service it is, and there's different codes for that, but basically, is it fiber connection? Is it coax cable? Is it DSL? Is it wireless? Is it satellite? If they were going to be doing that. So they have to provide that, and they have to just have a little checkbox, yes or no, or true or false, as to whether it's low latency. And low latency, as far as this Act goes, is anything that's 100 milliseconds or less round trip, which is really not that low. I mean, that's very reasonable. Almost anybody can do that. Even lower orbit satellites can hit that 100 millisecond latency. The only thing that couldn't probably, unless you had a really terrible wired service, would be something like a geosynchronous satellite. That just does not qualify for low latency. So that's what they have to provide. And then let's see what else it says here. So fixed broadband service providers access the preliminary Fabric using the process described in our first Fabric public notice. They do not need to execute. Okay, so if you did the preliminary Fabric, you do not need to execute a new license agreement and may access the production Fabric data files for the relevant geographic areas via a link that will be emailed to them by the Commission's Fabric contractor, CostQuest. So if you've already gone into the preliminary Fabric and you're taking care of that registration, then it sounds like you're going to automatically get an email to the contact that was working with that from CostQuest. Fixed broadband service providers that did not access the preliminary Fabric may now access the production Fabric by sending an email to CostQuest at nbfsupport@costquest.com with the name and email of the provider's contact person, the provider's name, and the provider's FCC registration number, or RFRN. CostQuest will provide those users with instructions on how to access the Fabric, which can be done after the user completes the online form and executes a license agreement with CostQuest. If you haven't done that, do that now, because it says here, actually it doesn't say here, but I'll show you in a minute. So further here it says the process for state, local, and tribal government entities to access the Fabric data files differs somewhat from the process for service providers. It also mentions that government entities have to get the FRN, which they may not have already. So they need that in order to log into the system. So you'll have to do some registration. That could take some time. If you don't already have an FRN, you should be doing that. But also here, notice it says, CostQuest will process license requests as quickly as possible, but depending on the number of pending requests from providers and governmental entities, delivery of the data files may take up to 2 weeks from the time the entity information is submitted in the BDC system. So in other words, that could even lengthen, or shorten the amount of time that you have to get your filing in. So it's going to shorten your filing window. So you want to go ahead and, again, you can do this now. So if you have not gotten into the preliminary Fabric and have not requested access to that and have your registration all in for that, you should be doing this part of it today, because you're going to have to do this. Again, you'll have less than 2 months if you have to wait on them there. For more information, questions about how to access the Fabric and about the license agreement associated with the Fabric should be addressed to nbfsupport@costquest.com. For information about the Fabric or the Broadband Data Collection, please visit the Broadband Data Collection website and then it's got the website here. Again, I'll link to several of these things at the end. I'll link to some help information from the FCC on how to do all of this. I'll link to this public notice. So I'll provide some helpful links, hopefully, for you at the end of this. But this is kind of the first step of this in order for the FCC to start collecting this data. So the preliminary Fabric was out there, and now you can actually start, or I should say starting June 30th, you can actually start submitting your data. Hopefully, if you are an ISP, you've already looked at the preliminary Fabric, you're already in the process of figuring that out. Maybe you've already figured out how you're going to do that and are just kind of waiting for this June 30th date to get the production Fabric, or even now you can get the production Fabric, to get the production Fabric ready to go ahead and upload that to the FCC, and then you're done, at least for 6 months or so. So again, this is a exercise you're going to have to go through every 6 months, but once it's done the first time, I think then it's just a matter of keeping track of changes. So if you have your Fabric in and you don't change anything, let's say 6 months from now when you have to do it again, let's say the first of the year, if you're still offering the same speeds and the same latency and the same addresses, then you're not changing anything. You're just kind of reloading what you did before. If you make changes, if you have suddenly, let's say, instead of offering half a gig service, you go to a gig, then you just need to change the data in the file to whichever areas that you have upgraded. Maybe it's all of them. You just need to change that one data point. That's not that big a deal. If you then, let's say, roll out a new service area, then you're going to have to get all of those addresses, match them up with the FCC location data. So that's going to be a little bit difficult. You're going to match those locations up again, but you've been through it before, so hopefully you know how to do that. Match up those new locations in the new service area. Add all of the data as far as what type of service it is, type of fixed wireless or fixed wired service it is, the latency, the max speed, upload and download, those kinds of things. So you got to get all of that, update your file, and then the next time that you file, you would file the updated one. So you don't need to do that on an ongoing basis, just every 6 months or so when that happens. Now, as far as, a lot of people will say, wow, so ISPs can lie. They can say, hey, we're offering, gig service here, and they're not. Or they say they offer 100 by 20, but I'm lucky if I get 40 or 20 or something like that. Well, that's why there's a challenge process. So, some of it is where maybe people put in an address that they don't serve at all, or it may be that they are really not providing the speeds that they're advertising. So we'll have to see how that challenge process goes, but that's going to take some time. The FCC is supposed to release the first iteration of these broadband maps in around November or so, and then the challenge process takes place from there, and I think there's going to be a lot of back and forth on that as far as which locations actually have service, and then the speeds that are actually being received at those services, because these are self-reported by the ISP, but there is the challenge process to take care of that. And then also, a lot of people will say, well, they can lie. Well, the other part of this is if somebody takes money from this, from any federal funds, from this program or other funds like RDOF or even CAF2, they have to do performance testing, and they have to do performance testing that shows they're meeting the speeds and that they're meeting the latency. Now, that's not required if they're not taking money, but for the purposes of the map, there is this challenge process. Thanks for joining me. If this was helpful, go ahead and give me a thumbs up on the video. If you're not subscribed, click the subscribe button, ring the little bell, and you will be notified when I'm live. So I will see you next week for Broadband Deployment News. Take care.